morning and welcome. Welcome to Eclipse Day. Thank you all for coming. I'm Dr. Albert Glinsky, the director of the music composition program here at Mercyhurst University. And our presentation today is dealing with, I guess I could say, the music of the spheres, going all the way back to the Greeks and Aristotle and the 16th century astronomer Kepler. There was an interest in the idea that maybe the spheres themselves and the rotation of the spheres make some kind of music. And so there's always been a fascination with that. Some of you may be familiar with what's probably the most famous example of astrological, I should say astronomical inspiration for music, and that is the Gustav Holst planets, the orchestral work. And I just learned recently that Coldplay just came out with an album in 2021 called Music of the Spheres. Today we have a special guest coming from New York City, Dr. Bruce Lazarus. He is the music director of the Joffrey Ballet School, and he is a colleague of mine. We went to school together. We go all the way back to our undergraduate years at Juilliard, and ever since I've known him, he's had a particular fascination with outer space, and he is quite knowledgeable about the planets and about the galaxies, and so he has turned a lot of his musical inspiration into ways to bring this out. So I want to introduce you to him. Let's welcome Dr. Bruce Lazarus.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Glinsky. It is such a pleasure to be here at Mercyhurst this morning, and I sure hope we get to see some nice eclipse action. If not, we've had a wonderful day talking about astronomy and other wonderful things. So today I'd like to talk about my piano cycle called the Messier star clusters and nebulas. And I will talk more about French scientist Charles Messier, but I thought it would be great if we started off just talking about one of the Messier objects and the music that I've composed to represent it. So this object behind me on the screen is nicknamed the Sombrero Galaxy, and it has nothing to do with Mexico or anything like that. It's just a description of its shape. This is a contemporary image of the Sombrero Galaxy, but had you seen a photograph of this galaxy back in the 1930s, 1940s, it would have been a tiny object on a big photographic plate and would have looked a lot like a Mexican hat. Now, with the fantastic images we have from the Hubble telescope and the Webb telescope, and even some gifted amateur stellar photographers with their home equipment, this is the kind of view of objects like the Sombrero Galaxy that we get. So I'm going to play you a video of the music accompanied by a few images of the Sombrero. But first I'd like to give you an overview of how I look at these celestial objects and how I interpret them in music. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the overall structure of galaxies like the Milky Way, our home galaxy, and our big neighboring galaxy, the Andromeda Galaxy, where they tend to be, I'm sure you've all seen hundreds of pictures of this, enormous pinwheels in space that are rotating around a central hub, which looks to us like they're not moving at all, but they are rotating at rates such as once every 10 million years or 14 million years. I found that does something to our sense of time. If you stop to think about it, is 14 million years a very brief amount of time for a galaxy that's spinning around, or is it just an amount of time that seems to stretch for infinity, for our short lifetimes here on Earth? I can't imagine a time span of 14 million years. I can imagine next year, but 14 million years, not a chance. So this does interesting things to our sense of time. Where the Sombrero galaxy is different from the Milky Way and the Andromeda is that our galaxies tend to orbit around itself in a single plane, whereas the Sombrero galaxy is kind of a double. So there's a rotation like this, but there's also a rotation like this. So we get, in Earth terms, we get a horizontal rotation and we get a vertical rotation, which is pretty unusual. I don't know whether we have been able to observe any other galaxies which have that particular structure. Now, I will pivot back to my own Messier pieces, but let's just focus on the Sombrero for a moment. I spend a lot of time looking at these objects and trying to figure out how can I best interpret these musically. And in studying the Sombrero, I read magazines, I look for books, and so on. I gather as much information as I can on these. I thought of one of my favorite performers, which is the juggler Michael Motion, who you may be familiar with. If you are lucky enough to watch Michael Motion for a long period of time, it starts to look like, although he only has two hands, you start to see all sorts of different patterns. And I'm going to try to do a little experiment here. So I'm going to run a little bit of this Michael Motion here, and I'm going to play the very opening of the Sombrero piece. So maybe you can see a parallel between the moving juggling balls and the music. So I've got to be quick. So I'm going to start this video right now. About juggling, the act of juggling, and I thought about Michael Motion constantly while I was composing this work. So let's go ahead and hear it. This is what we like to call a scrolling video of the score. I'm combining some musical notation for those of you who are musicians out there, along with the music and visions of the Sombrero. Thank you so much. I think we are pushing the limits of our PA system here, wonderful as it is. So there are some sounds in there that sounded a little bit like claves, which may or may not be appropriate for a piece called the Sombrero, but there's actually no claves in this piece. It's just piano. Well, I had wanted to speak a little bit about Charles Messier. That must be the next slide that's coming up. Yes, it is indeed. So I'll talk a little bit about the piece itself. This is a cover of the album. It's available for streaming or on CD if you're interested. The Messier Star Clusters and Nebula for piano. So I promise you get to Charles Messier in a moment, but Charles Messier, in short, cataloged 104 objects in the night sky. And if you were to take a look at any present issue of Sky and Telescope magazine or Astronomy magazine or what have you, any contemporary publication dealing with astronomy, you will still see references to Messier numbers. So it happens that the Sombrero galaxy, which you just heard, is known commonly as Messier 104. Now, I should mention that I don't have all the Messier numbers memorized, and I sometimes mess up on them. So if there are any fact checkers in the audience, please forgive me if I say the wrong number from time to time. So this is the album cover, as I said, and I want to mention in particular the image on the front cover because it's very special to me. It represents, at least in a stylized sort of way, the Orion Nebula, the gaseous cloud that's found in the constellation Orion. It's a stylization, so it doesn't quite look like that. It's the artist's conception of Orion. And the artist, as you can see, is John Lomborg, who also, if you looked quickly, was kind enough to contribute a view of the Sombrero Galaxy in the video you just saw. So John Lomborg was an early influence on my work. When I was a teenager, my dad came home from work one day and presented me with a copy of The Cosmic Connection. That was an early book by Carl Sagan, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. And just looking through the book, even without reading it, I saw that there were these wonderful illustrations that combined astronomy with kind of a mystical sense of the universe. And I just looked through the book and I saw that all of the illustrations were by John Lomborg. I thought, wow, what a wonderful artist. And it turned out that John Lomborg created almost all the illustrations for Carl Sagan in those early books, and also the TV series Cosmos. That's the earlier Cosmos series that was on public television. Since 2014, I've curated a Facebook group called Astronomy and the Arts, and I was very, very fortunate to make John Lomborg's acquaintance online, and we corresponded for a number of years, and then finally last year at the New York Museum of Natural History, John and I were able to meet in person. He was also instrumental in collecting the music for the golden records that went up with the Voyager interstellar probes, and seem to be still working, at least off and on, to this present day. So I just wanted to point out that cover picture by John Lomborg. I musicalized 14 Messier Objects, and then recorded them all in a single day in New York City, helped by my recording engineer. His name is Eric Summers. So finally, Charles Messier, French astronomer of the 17th, 18th century. And we have a picture of Messier here surrounded by contemporary views of Messier objects. So Messier was a prominent astronomer of his time, but was not as famous as his good buddy Edmund Halley, who was the one who discovered and plotted out the orbit of Halley's Comet, which I kind of sort of saw in the mid-80s, 1980s with my own eyes. But Messier wanted to be as famous as his friend Sir Halley and spent a great deal of his observing time looking for that one comet that would make him famous. Now, fortunately for Messier, he did discover a whole number of comets which bear his name, but they're not periodic like Halley's Comet. They're not going to return every 76 years. They may return every 1,500 years and so on. So it's a long wait to see a comet Messier 1, Messier 2, Messier 3. But he did spend a lot of time observing the night sky, and he kept seeing these little fuzzy clouds, or nebulae in plural. And in studying them, he would go, "Eureka, I found a comet," and continue to study them, and then say, no, actually that's not a comet, that's just one of these little cloudy patches in the sky. So what he started to do to get all these annoying nebulae out of the way is compile a catalog of things in the night sky which kind of sort of look like comets, but were not actually comets. And he did this in a list form, starting with Messier 1, Messier 2, all the way up to Messier either 104 or Messier 112. There's some controversy about how high up the numbers go up. And he never saw them as anything but cloudy patches. So now, I'm not a Messier scholar, but if you look at his original notebooks, it says things like the nebula in the constellation Andromeda, the nebula in Orion, and maybe this the sombrero, the nebula in some such constellation. I have forgotten which constellation the Sombrero Galaxy is in. But he didn't know what they were, really. He drew them in his notebooks and numbered them and then said, okay, forget it, they're not comets, I don't care. Well, about the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, astronomers started to discern what our own Milky Way was. That huge expanse we see in a very clear night. I have no doubt that your skies are clearer here in Erie than they are in New York City, where all I can see are a couple of bright planets and maybe the star Sirius, and that's about it. So I envy you. At any rate, I very seldom get to see the Milky Way myself, but scientists around the beginning of the 20th century started to discern that the Milky Way actually has those spiral arms, much like the Andromeda Nebula, and there became this idea that these are all Milky Ways, like taking the word galaxy from lactation, the idea of creating milk, and so on with its Latin roots, so that became galaxy. So they were Milky Way-like, or galactic, like the Milky Way. And that's about when, and I don't have the exact date, but scientists started talking about the Andromeda Galaxy, or Messier 104, like a hat, sombrero galaxy, and so forth. And other objects that really were cloudy patches, kind of, sort of, like the nebula in Orion stayed as the Orion Nebula. Now, this wonderful picture here shows, of course, Messier in the middle, surrounded by contemporary views of Messier objects. Like in the upper left, top left, something that looks like an explosion. It's called the Crab Nebula, and it is Messier 1, the Crab Nebula. That's an example of a star that has exploded. It's just blown itself up, a supernova, which the Chinese astronomers had observed in somewhere around 800 CE. But for some reason, no one in Europe seems to have noticed it, so it's odd. But that's what it looks like now, and nothing could look more like an explosion. Of course, Messier didn't know that. It was a little cloudy dot in his, I don't know, 30-power primitive refractor telescope. So I had, as Dr. Glinsky mentioned, I had always been interested in astronomy. I was a musician since I was a little kid, and at some point in my teenage years, I decided to focus in on composing music. I've always had an interest in astronomy, and during my Juilliard days, I did compose a number of pieces on astronomical themes. Then I went away from that for several years, and I started writing more folky music, neoclassical, folky, jazzy, however you want to term it, but reflected more the Earth, placing us in space. And then in the late 1990s, I thought, gosh, I really want to go back to astronomy-themed music. And I was doing other things. I was writing for theater and so on. That was something I really wanted to do. The best way I found immediately to handle that was to have people singing about it. So I wrote a number of pieces for chorus and solo voice on astronomy themes. But I'm a pianist, and I thought I really want a vehicle for myself so I could perform it and talk about it, say, to wonderful audiences like yourself. So how should I do this? In the 1950s and 60s, we could see the Messier objects in their black and white photos. And some objects like the Trifid Nebula, the Crab Nebula, even the Andromeda Galaxy, some of those globular clusters like in the lowest right on the screen, often appeared in science fiction and TV shows of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and even the early 70s, when they were trying to imply that our characters were far away from Earth and heading into the unknown. Particularly the Trifid Nebula made appearances on The Outer Limits, The Twilight Zone, Lost in Space, and even Star Trek, I believe, and became sort of iconic for heading out into the unknown across the light years. And that sort of thing was fun, but didn't inspire me musically, at least not very much. But in the late 90s came the Hubble telescope, and all of a sudden these objects had color and shape, and also I could discern certain movements in them. So they really did seem to be objects which rotated like a spiral galaxy, or exploding like that Crab Nebula is exploding, or they're dispersing, coalescing, rotating, and so forth. And those movement ideas suggested to me musical ideas. I understood what rotation meant in music, or exploding means in music. And I thought, oh, well, I've got to do something with this. So I picked what I thought were the 14 most recognizable Messier objects: the Sombrero, the Andromeda Galaxy, the Trifid Nebula, and a few others, which we had seen on television and the movies, and decided to musicalize them. And then I reached 14 of them, and the project had taken me 4 years, from 2008 to 2012. I said, that's it, I'm done with this. Now I have the long process of practicing them, trying to figure out how to play them. Some of them were terribly difficult for me. And I had, who is this idiot who wrote such difficult piano music that I have to practice it for hours? And then I looked in a mirror and said, golly, why didn't I make these a little bit easier? But anyway, I'm very pleased with how the entire set came out. This is Messier 57, which we call the Ring Nebula. Now, somewhere in the middle of this ring-like cloud is a star which, achieving some kind of stellar old age, has actually collapsed into itself. But rather than exploding, it has sort of blown off its outer layer, which we now see centuries later as a ring that's surrounding something in the center. There is a star right in the middle of the ring. I'm not sure, maybe somebody can tell me, whether that's the original star which blew off its outer ring, or if that's just a star in our own Milky Way, which just so happens to be in the, the Ring Nebula is in the Milky Way. It's not that big an object. It's about 4 light years from left to right in our pictures. It's in the Milky Way. I misspoke there. But it's whether that central star just happens to be in our line of sight between us and the Ring Nebula, I really don't know. But somewhere in there is a star which blew out its outer layer. This looks like a ring to us, but that's because it's really pretty transparent. And so the part of the ring that's facing us is a lot clearer than the outsides of the ring. But if we were to somehow get a different perspective on this, which is impossible for Earth, unless you have a computer program which can actually spin the object around in 3D, it would actually look like a ball of gas that is slowly moving away from a central point, and then over the period of, I don't know how long, centuries, thousands of years, millions of years, is gradually dispersing. So in composing the Ring Nebula piece, I decided to start off with some musical materials which are relatively solid, but which would gradually disperse over the 2.5-minute length of the piece. So I'd like to play for you the Ring Nebula piece. Luckily, I have a score. Shall I skip ahead a little bit? So I'd like to talk very briefly about the Andromeda Galaxy, also known as Messier 31. This is our nearest galactic, or nearest gigantic galactic neighbor in space, and quite a beautiful object. Its spiral arm structure is quite a bit more complex than our own Milky Way. And I'll just show you very briefly how I interpreted these spiral arms in music. There are actually 4 layers of material. There's a melody on top. There's a second layer right under that. I'm going to play both together. That's just my right hand. And then the left hand represents another spiral arm. So I can put those together. And then there's one more layer that comes in about halfway through the piece, down in the bass. So it sounds like this. Well, you'll hear it when it comes up in the music. Now this is a scrolling score, so those of musicians in the room, you'll be able to follow along with the music. So that's the first half of Messier 31, the Andromeda Galaxy. Now I'd like to change the subject just for a moment now and talk about another work of mine from about 2010 in honor of the events this afternoon. I've had a long association with the North Cambridge Family Opera Chorus. That's Cambridge in Massachusetts, where we would find Harvard and MIT. And the North Cambridge Chorus consists of grown-ups who are largely professors at those universities, and also they're incredibly smart and talented children, aged from 8 to 12 years old. When we first made contact, the initial commission for me was to compose a 15-minute work talking about lunar and solar eclipses. And so I'd like to present to you today the section that deals with the solar eclipse. It's partly on my lyrics and also lyrics contributed by a couple of friends of mine. And I will present it in scrolling form fashion, so make it easier for you to follow the words. I'd just like to draw your attention to the middle section where the children are counting the minutes of an eclipse while the adults are describing what's going on in the nature around them. So the solar eclipse section of Regarding Eclipses. You've seen this diagram before. So the name of the day. And here are my performers, and they're wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Dr. Lazarus. This is wonderful. So we probably have just a minute or two for questions. Does anyone have any questions at all? No questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming, and hope you enjoy the view of the eclipse from wherever you will be enjoying it today. And have a wonderful day. There's another lecture coming in here in just a few minutes, so we have to vacate quickly. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful afternoon.